Jake had always enjoyed the quiet rhythm of his little neighborhood. The porch lights glowing softly in the evening, kids riding their bikes along the sidewalks, neighbors waving as they tended their gardens. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other and life moved at a comfortable pace. So when the letter arrived, stamped with the HOA logo, Jake felt a knot form in his stomach. He opened it carefully and read the words that made his heart skip a beat. Notice of fine, $500 for lighting violation. Jake blinked, rereading the notice. A lighting violation? He had always taken pride in keeping his home inviting. His porch lights were modest, warm, and welcoming. What could possibly be wrong? The letter was signed by Susan, Old Lady Susan, as most neighbors quietly called her. She had been on the HOA board for years and was known for being, well, strict. Some said she cared a little too much about every detail, but others admired her dedication. Jake decided to call the HOA office for clarification. After a brief hold, a polite voice explained that the fine was due to the brightness of his porch lights, which, according to their guidelines, exceeded the approved level. "But my lights are just regular bulbs," Jake protested gently. "They're soft yellow, nothing harsh." The representative repeated the same rules, explaining that any light spilling beyond a certain angle could be subject to fine. Jake felt frustration creeping in, but kept his tone calm. He asked if there was a way to appeal. Susan herself called back the next day. Her voice was firm but polite. "Jake, I understand you're upset, but rules are rules. We have to maintain consistency. It's about preserving the neighborhood's character." Jake took a deep breath. "I get that, Susan. But I'd love to work together to find a solution that keeps my home welcoming and fits the guidelines." Susan hesitated for a moment. "You can submit a request for a lighting adjustment, but the fine will stand until then." Jake hung up, feeling a mix of irritation and determination. It wasn't just about the money. It was the principle, the feeling that someone was telling him how to live in his own home. That evening, Jake stepped onto his porch and looked up at his warm, glowing lights. They had welcomed friends and family for years, casting a soft, comforting glow that made the house feel alive. He couldn't imagine changing them simply because someone else said so. But as he watched the lights shimmer in the dusk, a thought sparked in his mind. Maybe this was the start of something bigger. The next morning, Jake drove out to the local real estate office. He had heard a lot about the empty lot next to Susan's house, a rare piece of land that had recently come on the market. Usually, no one moved fast enough to grab it. But Jake was feeling bold. Inside the agent's office, Jake inquired about the property. The agent smiled. "It's a great spot, close-knit neighborhood, peaceful views. You'd be the only neighbor right next to Susan." Jake laughed. "That sounds interesting." A week later, Jake signed the papers and became the new owner. Of the lot next to Susan's house, word spread quickly. Neighbors exchanged curious glances. Why would Jake buy that particular lot, especially with the recent tension? Susan's reaction was quiet at first, a brief, surprised glance when she learned about the purchase. But Jake could sense the shift. Suddenly, the neighborhood felt a little smaller, a little more intertwined. That evening, Jake stood on his new property and looked across the fence at Susan's home. For the first time, he wondered what stories lay behind her firm voice and unwavering rules. Maybe, he thought, there was more to Old Lady Susan than the letter demanding a fine dot. As the sun set, his porch lights flickered on, warm and steady. This was just the beginning of a new chapter, one that neither of them could have predicted. The morning after Jake bought the lot next to Susan's house, the neighborhood felt different, quieter somehow. People walked a little slower, whispered a little more, and glanced toward Susan's home with a mixture of curiosity and uncertainty. Jake, however, was eager to learn more. Susan had always seemed like a mystery wrapped in a sharp gaze and a clipped tone, but buying the lot next to her meant he'd soon be neighbors. He wanted to understand her better. He started by chatting with Mrs. Henderson, a longtime resident who had lived there nearly as long as Susan. "Oh, Susan's been part of this neighborhood for decades," Mrs. Henderson said with a warm smile. "She's seen it all, the good times, the growing pains. She cares deeply about keeping things just right. But she's tough, isn't she?" Jake asked gently. Mrs. Henderson nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, she can be. But it's because she's protective. She's always been the one to make sure everyone follows the rules. Sometimes that's a hard role to play." Jake thanked her and decided to do a little more digging. He found some old newsletters from the HOA's early days. There were photos of Susan at meetings, organizing events, and helping new neighbors get settled. The articles praised her dedication and strong sense of community. Still, the question lingered. Why was she so strict? Jake's curiosity grew, so he started paying closer attention whenever he saw Susan out and about. One afternoon, he spotted her tending her garden, her movements careful but precise. He decided to say hello. "Hi, Susan," Jake called as he approached the fence dividing their properties. "I wanted to thank you for all the years you've spent keeping this neighborhood safe and welcoming." Susan paused, her expression softening slightly. "Thank you, Jake. It's not always easy, but it's important work." Jake smiled. "I'm hoping to make this place just as special." Susan looked at the lot he'd just bought and sighed. "I have my reasons for being careful. This neighborhood means a lot to me." Jake couldn't stop thinking about Susan's words. He wondered what experiences had shaped her so deeply. The next day, Jake talked with Mr. Collins, who had lived next door to Susan when they were both younger. Over coffee, Mr. Collins shared stories about Susan's past, how she had lost her husband years ago, and had taken it upon herself to create stability for herself and those around her. "She's a bit of a guardian," Mr. Collins said kindly. "Maybe sometimes too much so, but her heart's in the right place." Jake felt a new respect growing. Susan's strictness was not just about rules. It was about love, protection, and perhaps a fear of losing what mattered most. With this understanding, Jake felt ready to face the next steps. He realized that any change in the neighborhood would need patience, kindness, and a willingness to listen, especially when it came to Susan. That weekend, Jake started planning how he could turn the empty lot into a welcoming space, not just for himself, but for everyone. Maybe, he thought, a garden, a place to gather. Something that could soften the edges and invite connection as he worked late into the evening. Planting seeds and imagining flowers blooming, Jake felt hopeful. The story of the neighborhood was changing, and he wanted to be part of the next chapter. Across the fence, Susan's porch light flickered on, steady and warm. It was a small sign, but to Jake, it meant something bigger. A quiet invitation, perhaps, to find common ground. The days following Jake's purchase of the lot next to Susan's house were filled with whispers and curious glances from neighbors. Everyone wanted to know what Jake planned to do with the empty space, especially since it was now so close to Susan, whose presence was well known throughout the neighborhood. Jake, however, had a clear idea. This wasn't just about buying land. It was about creating a place that reflected his values: warmth, community, and connection. He wanted to prove that property wasn't just about rules and boundaries. It could be about bringing people together. On a bright Saturday morning, Jake rolled up his sleeves and began work. He started by clearing some of the wild growth that had taken over the lot. As he worked, neighbors slowly came out to watch, some offering smiles, others hesitant but interested. A few kids gathered near the fence, asking questions. Jake handed out small packets of flower seeds. "These will grow into sunflowers," he said with a grin. "Bright and cheerful, just like this neighborhood should be." By midday, word had reached Susan. She watched quietly from her porch, a subtle crease of concern on her forehead. The lot had always been an empty space, unpredictable, wild. Now it was transforming, and she wasn't sure what to make of it. Later that afternoon, Susan approached Jake while he was planting a row of tulips near the back of the lot. "Jake," she said, her voice steady but curious, "what exactly are you planting here?" Jake looked up, wiping dirt from his hands. "I want to create a space where neighbors can come together, a garden, a spot to relax, maybe even hold small gatherings. Somewhere that feels welcoming." Susan crossed her arms, studying the blooming tulips and neat rows. "It's a nice idea, but you have to understand the neighborhood has standards. We can't just let things grow however we want." Jake nodded. "I get that, Susan, and I respect the history here. But maybe we can find a way to balance tradition with something fresh." Susan looked away, her expression softening. "I suppose there's room for that." That evening, Jake reflected on the conversation. He realized Susan's protective nature wasn't just about rules. It was about preserving a feeling of home, a place where people felt safe and cared for. His challenge was to show her that change didn't mean losing that the next week. Jake visited the local hardware store to buy supplies for a small bench and a bird feeder. He placed them carefully among the flowers, imagining neighbors sitting and chatting, watching the birds flit from branch to branch. He also started drafting ideas for a small neighborhood newsletter, something positive and inclusive, to share stories and events and bring people closer. Word of Jake's project reached the HOA board, and whispers of a meeting to discuss the new lot began circulating. Susan prepared to represent her usual position, caution and adherence to the guidelines, but she also found herself wondering if maybe, just maybe, there was a different way forward. That Saturday, the neighborhood gathered for a casual walk through the block. Jake invited neighbors to visit the lot and see the progress. People stopped to admire the flowers, touch the smooth wood of the bench, and breathe in the fresh air. Old Mrs. Henderson brought lemonade and cookies, placing them on a makeshift table near the lot's entrance. "It's lovely," she said warmly. "Wonderful change." Even Susan lingered longer than expected, quietly observing the smiles and chatter around the new garden. Jake caught her eye and nodded. "Thank you for giving it a chance." Susan returned the nod, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "We'll see where this goes." That night, as the neighborhood lights twinkled on, Jake felt a sense of hope growing. Change was never easy, especially in a place with deep roots, but with patience, respect, and a little boldness, new beginnings were possible. And for the first time since the fine notice arrived, Jake felt that this chapter might end not with a conflict, but with connection. As word spread about Jake's new lot and the garden he was creating, the neighborhood began to stir with quiet excitement. Conversations at mailboxes and during morning walks carried questions and speculations. What was Jake up to? Could this change the feel of their familiar streets? Jake noticed the shift too. Neighbors who had once been distant started stopping by, curious about the flowers and the bench. A few brought seedlings to contribute. The lot was slowly becoming a shared project, a bright spot in their daily lives. But not everyone was completely at ease. The HOA board scheduled a meeting to discuss recent changes in the neighborhood, including Jake's purchase and his plans for the lot. The news made the rounds quickly, and residents packed the small community room with a mix of anticipation and concern. Susan sat near the front, her posture straight but her eyes thoughtful. She had always been a strong voice for order and tradition. But lately she had been reconsidering her views. The meeting began with the usual agenda: reports on maintenance, upcoming events, and reminders of neighborhood guidelines. Then came the topic everyone had been waiting for. The HOA president, Mr. Thompson, addressed the room. we need to discuss the recent purchase of the vacant lot next to Susan's house and the developments there. Many residents have expressed interest and some concern about what's being planned. Jake stood up when called, his calm presence filling the room. Thank you, Mr. Thompson. I want to assure everyone that my goal is to enhance the neighborhood, not disrupt it. I'm working to create a welcoming garden and community space that everyone can enjoy. Murmurs of approval mixed with cautious questions. One neighbor raised a hand. How will this affect property values? And what about upkeep? Jake smiled. I'm committed to maintaining the lot and keeping it tidy. I believe a beautiful space will only add to the neighborhood's charm. Susan spoke next, surprising many. Jake has been thoughtful in his approach. I've watched the progress and have seen neighbors respond positively. While we must respect our guidelines, I believe we can find a balance. The room settled into a respectful discussion, with neighbors sharing ideas about community activities, gardening, and ways to keep the neighborhood welcoming for all. By the meeting's end, the board agreed to support Jake's project with some guidelines to ensure the space remained orderly and safe. Outside the community room, Susan approached. Jake, you did well tonight. Jake nodded. Thanks, Susan, your support means a lot. She smiled softly. I'm learning to see things from a different perspective. In the days that followed, the garden continued to flourish. Neighbors brought potted plants and children, placed hand-painted stones along the path. The lot was no longer just Jake's. It was becoming the neighborhood's. Susan found herself spending more time near the fence, chatting with neighbors and even helping with planting. Her careful nature blended with Jake's welcoming spirit, creating a new energy in the air. One afternoon, Jake organized a small gathering in the garden. Lemonade homemade, hokies, and plenty of laughter. Susan raised her glass in a quiet toast to new beginnings, she said. Jake smiled. To community. As twilight settled, porch lights flickered on, their warm glow reflecting the changing heart of the neighborhood. What had started as a dispute over a fine had grown into something far greater, a chance to bring people together and nurture the roots of friendship. Jake looked across the lot toward Susan's house, feeling hopeful. The journey wasn't over, but the path forward was clear. With kindness, patience, and open hearts, the neighborhood was ready to grow in ways they had never imagined. The following weeks were filled with quiet transformation. The empty lot, once a patch of overgrown weeds and forgotten debris, blossoming into a small sanctuary of colors and life. Jake's vision was unfolding, and the neighborhood was beginning to see the beauty in change. Jake spent his mornings tending the garden, carefully planting new shrubs and lining pathways with smooth stones. He installed a few benches, inviting neighbors to sit, relax, and enjoy the peaceful surroundings. Children would often come by after school, their laughter echoing as they chased butterflies or helped water the flowers. What made the space truly special, though, wasn't just the plants or the benches. It was the spirit that was growing alongside them. Susan, who had once stood firmly on the sidelines, found herself drawn closer. At first, she observed from her porch, watching Jake's work with a curious, cautious eye. But one afternoon, she surprised Jake by appearing at the garden gate, holding a small pot of lavender. I thought this might add a pleasant scent, she said quietly, offering the plant. Jake smiled warmly. Thank you, Susan. It's perfect. From that moment, a new rhythm emerged. Susan began stopping by more often, helping with pruning and sharing stories about the neighborhood's past. Her sharp eyes still noticed every detail, but now they softened with appreciation. Neighbors, too, embraced the garden. Mrs. Henderson brought homemade jam to share at an impromptu picnic on the lawn. Mr. Collins offered advice on growing native plants. Even the children started a small corner with colorful flowers and painted signs. Jake took the opportunity to set up a small notice board near the entrance, inviting suggestions and announcements. It became a hub for neighborhood news, reminders about yard sales, birthdays, and weekend get-togethers. Slowly but surely, the lot was no longer just Jake's land. It was becoming a shared space, a new heart for the neighborhood yet. Despite the growing warmth, Jake remained mindful of the delicate balance. He knew Susan's commitment to the community ran deep, and he wanted to respect her dedication while bringing fresh energy one afternoon. As they sat on a bench beneath a blossoming tree, Susan turned to Jake. "I admit, I wasn't sure about your plans at first," she said. "But seeing how much this means to you and how the neighbors are coming together, it's changed my mind." Jake nodded. "I wanted this to be more than just a garden. It's about connection, bringing people closer." Susan smiled, a rare softness in her eyes. "You're doing good work, Jake. Just remember, traditions have a way of grounding us." "I hope we can keep that balance." Jake agreed. "I wouldn't want it any other way." As spring turned to summer, the garden flourished under the care of many hands. Evening gatherings became common, neighbors sharing stories, enjoying the warm light of lanterns strung between trees. The once tense boundary between Jake and Susan was now a space of shared laughter and understanding. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and porch lights glowed softly, Jake looked out over the garden. The flowers swayed gently in the breeze, and neighbors chatted nearby, their faces lit with contentment. He thought back to the day he received that unexpected fine a moment that had set this entire journey in motion. What had begun as a source of frustration had grown into a story of community, respect, and new beginnings. Jake smiled. Change wasn't always easy, but sometimes it was exactly what a neighborhood and a friendship needed. Just when Jake thought things were settling into a comfortable rhythm, life reminded him that change often brings unexpected challenges. One bright morning, as Jake was tending to the garden, he noticed a small group gathered near the community mailbox, whispering with concern. Curious, he walked over to find Mrs. Peters, a longtime resident, frowning as she held a letter from the HOA. "It seems there's been a complaint about the new garden," she said, her voice low but worried. "Some say it's not in line with the neighborhood guidelines." Jake felt a pang of disappointment but nodded. "I'll look into it." Sure enough, the HOA had received a formal complaint claiming that certain plants in the garden obstructed the sidewalk and that the space was being used for gatherings without prior approval. Jake wasn't surprised. Change often stirred mixed feelings. But he was determined not to let this slow progress. He called a meeting with Susan and a few HOA board members. Hoping to clear the air, Susan greeted him with a cautious smile. "I understand the concerns. The board's main priority is keeping things orderly." Jake agreed. "Absolutely. I want to work with you all to address these issues and find solutions that respect the rules and the community's interests." Together, they walked through the garden, identifying spots where plants could be trimmed or moved to keep walkways clear. Jake suggested creating a simple application process for small gatherings, ensuring transparency and cooperation. Susan nodded. "This is reasonable. If we keep communication open, there shouldn't be problems." The board appreciated Jake's willingness to collaborate, and soon a plan was drafted and shared with neighbors outlining garden guidelines and event procedures. Despite this progress, Jake could sense lingering skepticism from some residents. Change, even positive change, wasn't easy for everyone. One evening, as Jake closed up the garden, he found Susan waiting near the gate. "There's something I need to tell you," she said, her tone serious but kind. Jake listened as Susan shared stories of past conflicts in the neighborhood, times when misunderstandings had driven wedges between neighbors and threatened the peace they all valued. "I want to make sure that doesn't happen again," she said. "Your garden is a start, but we have to be careful. Jake respected her honesty and shared his own hopes. We can't please everyone all the time, he said, but if we keep talking and working together, I believe we can find a way forward. Susan smiled softly. You're right. And I'm glad you're here. The next few weeks were a test of patience and diplomacy. Jake attended HOA meetings regularly, offering updates and listening to concerns. He adjusted the garden as needed and made sure neighbors felt heard. Slowly, the tension eased. Children's laughter returned to the garden paths. Neighbors began to greet each other warmly, and Susan's watchful eye softened into one of quiet support. One afternoon, Jake received an unexpected note slipped under his door. It was from Susan. Thank you for your patience and dedication. Let's keep making this neighborhood a place we're proud to call home. Jake smiled, feeling the warmth of a hard-won friendship. That evening, as porch lights flickered on across the neighborhood, Jake stood in the garden, surrounded by blooming flowers and smiling faces. Challenges would come and go, but the bonds they were building, built on respect, understanding, and a shared vision, were here to stay. With the warmer months settling in, the garden had truly become the neighborhood's pride. Jake's vision had flourished, and even those once hesitant now found themselves drawn to the vibrant spot between the houses. One Saturday morning, as Jake tended to a bed of blooming daisies, Susan appeared, carrying a basket of freshly baked pastries. Her steps were steady, but her eyes carried a rare brightness. I thought this garden could use a celebration, she said, setting the basket on the bench. Something to bring everyone together. Jake looked up, surprised, but pleased. That sounds wonderful, Susan. Words spread quickly. Invitations were quietly passed from porch to porch. Neighbors started preparing baking, making decorations, and sharing ideas for games and music. The mood shifted from cautious to excited. By late afternoon, the garden was transformed. Strings of colorful lanterns hung from the trees. Picnic blankets dotted the grass, and the scent of freshly baked goods mingled with the fragrance of flowers. Neighbors gathered, some bringing instruments, others delicious dishes to share. Children darted between adults, playing tag or chasing fireflies. Susan, who had once been the neighborhood's stern enforcer, now mingled with laughter and easy conversation. She even led a group of kids in a game of hopscotch. Her face softened. With genuine joy, Jake watched, feeling a swell of pride and happiness. The space had become more than he imagined, a true center for friendship and community. As twilight deepened, Mr. Collins took out his guitar and began to play a gentle tune. Voices joined in, harmonizing under the glowing lanterns. Susan approached Jake, her eyes reflecting the warm light. I wasn't sure at first, but this is exactly what we needed. Jake smiled. It's amazing what happens when people come together. She nodded thoughtfully. You showed us all that change isn't about breaking traditions. It's about growing them. The evening continued with stories shared, plans made for future gatherings, and a deep sense of belonging that filled the air as neighbors began to say their goodbyes. Susan pulled Jake aside. There's one thing I want to make clear, she said gently. Thank you for reminding us what this neighborhood can be. Jake felt the weight of those words. From a simple find to a flourishing garden, the journey had been long and sometimes challenging, but moments like this made it all worthwhile. That night, as the last guests left and the garden grew quiet, Jake and Susan sat on a bench side by side, looking up at the stars. We make a good team, Susan said with a smile. We do, Jake agreed. The neighborhood was no longer just a collection of houses and rules. It had become a home shaped by respect, collaboration, and a shared vision for a brighter future. The celebration had marked a turning point, one that transformed the neighborhood spirit and deepened the bonds between its residents. Jake felt it every time he walked through the garden now, surrounded by familiar faces and warm greetings. But as summer settled into early fall, another kind of change quietly unfolded. One morning, as Jake watered the flower beds, he noticed Susan approaching with a letter in her hand and a thoughtful look in her eyes. "I've been meaning to talk to you," she said, settling onto a nearby bench. "About the neighborhood and about the future." Jake put down the watering can and gave her his full attention. Susan explained that she'd been considering stepping down from her role on the HOA board after many years of service. The responsibilities had grown heavier, and she wanted to focus more on her family and personal interests. "I want to make sure the neighborhood is left in good hands," she said, "and that the progress we've made together continues." Jake nodded, understanding the weight of the moment. Susan had been a steadfast guardian for the community, sometimes strict, often firm, but always with the neighborhood's best interests at heart. "I think the garden and the way we've brought people together shows the kind of community we can build," Jake replied. "I'd be honored to help carry that forward." Susan smiled, a mix of relief and pride in her expression. "I believe you're the right person for the job." Over the next few weeks, Jake prepared to take on a more active role in the HOA. He met with board members, learned about the processes, and listened closely to neighbors' hopes and concerns. Susan remained a trusted advisor, offering guidance and encouragement as Jake found his footing. One crisp autumn evening, the neighborhood gathered once more, this time for a meeting held outdoors, in the garden that had become their symbol of change, under strings of twinkling lights. Jake stood before the crowd, speaking with quiet confidence. "We've come a long way," he said. "From a single lot and a disagreement to a space that belongs to all of us. This garden reminds us that even small changes can grow into something meaningful when we work together." The neighbors applauded, their faces glowing with warmth and hope. Susan stepped forward, handing Jake a small plaque engraved with the words, "For dedication to community and growth." "I'm proud of what we've built," she said, "and excited to see where it goes next." The night air was filled with laughter, music, and plans for new projects, a neighborhood energized by the promise of continued collaboration. The evening wound down, Jake found a quiet moment to thank Susan personally. "Thank you for giving me a chance," he said sincerely, "for trusting me, even when it wasn't easy." Susan reached out, squeezing his hand. "Thank you for reminding us all what it means to be neighbors." Walking home later, Jake looked back at the glowing garden, now a beacon of unity and hope, that the journey from a $500 fine to owning a piece of the neighborhood, and then nurturing a shared space, had been full of surprises. But the greatest lesson was clear. True community isn't about rules or fences. It's about understanding, respect, and the courage to grow together. Jake smiled, ready for whatever the future held, because now they were not just neighbors. They were a neighborhood.